podcasting. How many of you know what podcasting is? Anybody know?
Kayla
Taylor, you
says,
want to tell us?
are you able to unmute, Kayla? I know some people told me they were having problems with their backgrounds today.
Okay,
Are,
podcasting is growing by leaps and bounds. So it's definitely a space that I love being in, and I hope that more people will get into podcasting soon. Okay, podcasting is when you talk about various subjects. Okay, true. That's partly correct. Anybody else? Kind of like the radio. Exactly. Yeah. When we hear radio, sometimes it's live, sometimes it's pre-recorded and presented as a live recording. Uh, a big secret in the news is that they record a lot of stuff in studio, and then they do something called overdubbing. So they go out and they get the video footage, and then they go into a studio booth and they record. They do voiceovers of the particular story that they're trying to present. So they get a lot of chance to practice and mess up. To be honest, that's why it looks so polished when they finally present to us the news in some cases. So podcasting started way back when, and way back when is when Apple. Any of you have an Apple phone, you may be familiar with uh, the, the there's a little device. I don't want to get too technical, but it was a little device, not like the iPhone, but it was a pod. It was a device that could capture audio, and you could play your music through it. And so somebody had the brilliant idea that they were going to start speaking as if they were a radio host, and that's how podcasts became popular. Wasn't very popular back then, but it's grown by just tremendous percentages over the last, I would say, 5 years. I've been thinking about podcasting for the last 3 to 4 years, but I was always nervous to get started because I wasn't really sure how to enter this space called podcast. So I finally just took the dive this year, back in May. I decided to invest in all of the equipment, and then took the rest of May to uh, learn how to use the equipment. And I'm still learning. It's a learning curve. But I wanted to come out of the gate with a quality of sound that people would appreciate. Sometimes when we're listening to people and the audio isn't that great, we have a tendency to tune people out. So, is there anyone interested in podcasts? Is there anyone in this group interested in podcasts? No one? All right.
I think might be still thinking about exactly what it is. Zanalia says yes, she's interested.
She's interested.
She said she'd like to do it for fun.
You like to do it for fun. Yeah, there are a lot of people out there who are doing it for fun and have become very successful at it. And some people are doing it for various other reasons. They want to get their message out there. So they're podcasting their particular category of topic. But Melissa, that video that I sent you, can you do that one up real quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. And then we'll talk a little bit about the things that I've gone through so far and started my own podcast.
Okay. Give me a second.
Okay.
I think sometimes I have too much stuff open. Video, how to start a podcast. Got it. There's an ad playing. Hold on a second.
And I'm the head of marketing at Buzzsprout, and you're watching video 1 of our How to Start a Podcast YouTube series. So over the next several videos, we're going to take you step by step through the entire process to launch your first podcast. And we're going to go pretty in depth here. We want to make sure that you have all of the best practices so that you can start your podcast on the right foot. So more people are listening to podcasts than ever before. According to Edison Research, the number of Americans who are listening to a podcast every week has grown over 100% in just the last 4 years. And 67 million Americans listen to a podcast every month. And as the audience for podcasts continue to grow, there's never been a better time to start a podcast, whether it be for a hobby, a business, nonprofit, or even a church. So if you follow the advice in this video series, you'll be primed to launch your own podcast and take advantage of what we think is a really exciting new medium. Podcasts are a great way to build a genuine connection with your audience. Instead of a fractured connection you might get through social media and sending out a tweet storm, podcasts allow you to engage with your audience in a unique, long-form content. There's podcasts I've listened to for years now, and though I've never met the people who actually put those podcasts out, you start to feel like you know the person who does the podcast. So that's a special connection that you may not get through text or even YouTube. Sometimes it feels like you're there in the room with the person who's doing the podcast. Every time you publish an episode, every one of your subscribers will get that episode in their podcast app automatically. There's not a special bell to ding or a secret algorithm to figure out. So as long as you're putting out great content, you'll slowly over time be building an audience of passionate fans. So why should you even listen to Buzzsprout at all? Well, Buzzsprout's been around for 10 years, and we've helped launch over 100,000 podcasts. We have a guide that we wrote on how to make a podcast, and that's been read over 500,000 times. We've also gone to, dozens of podcasting conferences and spoken to thousands of podcasters. So we're trying to bring all of that we've learned over those years together into this course. We hear all the time people are saying, am I a little late? We know that you're not too late because every few years another breakout show comes out. 2014 we had Serial. Then The Daily launched 2017. 2019, we've already had a bunch of new shows like The Dropout, 1619, Ron Burgundy podcast. All of those launched just this year. I think back to all the times we've gone to a conference, it's pretty common that someone's saying, I'm just about to launch. I'm just about to launch a podcast. We're like, great, that's awesome. And then the next year they say, I didn't launch yet, but I'm about to launch. I'm just polishing the last few episodes. And there's people that I've met multiple times over a couple years and they haven't launched. So I don't want you to be intimidated by the number of podcasts. I want you to think, I'm getting in now and I'm getting in early. Our research shows for every podcast there's 570 blogs and 65 YouTube channels. So just think about the opportunity there was to start a blog in like 2004. Yeah, there was a ton of written content all over like AOL.com or whatever it was back then. But there were also a lot of people coming online. And so as there were more people writing, there were more people reading. And that's what we're getting in podcasting. If you think only a quarter of Americans regularly listen to a podcast, imagine what 3/4 of Americans are doing right now. The head of Google Podcasts has said Google's goal is to double the amount of people that are listening to podcasts worldwide. So think about the opportunity that's there for you if a company like Google is putting their name behind this kind of audacious goal. So I hope I've convinced you of the incredible opportunity there is in podcasting. So now let's dive into how to start a podcast. Think about why you want to start a podcast. And The reason this is an important question is because it's going to inform a lot of what you do later. Another way to phrase this maybe is, what I want you to think about at least is, what's your goal? What's the purpose for your podcast? Here are the 4 most common goals that we hear from people. To generate leads for a business, for maybe your business. To become a recognized leader in an industry. To share an important message, or frankly, just to have fun. Now, as you think about those 4, I want you to also think about 2 reasons that are red flags. These are not good. If you want to become famous or you want to get rich, the chances that happen are so low. I would say those are not good reasons to start a podcast. While most shows can build a strong, passionate audience, it's only the lucky few that ever have a chance to turn their hosts into a star. So you're probably not going to become Joe Rogan. So it's good right now to go ahead and write down your answer. Why are you starting this podcast? And we'll refer back to it as we further develop your podcast concept. So now that we've got your purpose, what's your podcast about? And it can be as broad as pop culture or as focused as discussions about a recent Supreme Court ruling. The only requirement is that the topic has to be something you're passionate about, something you're excited to research and discuss on a regular basis. Once you have an idea of what the podcast is about, it's a good idea to do some market research. So search through Apple Podcasts and see if someone else is already doing it. If there is something, don't freak out. Just listen to a couple of their episodes to see what they're doing well and think of ways you can improve on it or maybe give that topic a different spin. When you're picking a podcast name, you'll want to pick something that's catchy, that's memorable. It will rank for keywords that are relevant to your podcast. Think about what people are searching that you would want your podcast to show up in front of them. So they're going to search something in Apple Podcasts, and then you want yours to show up. So I think of a show called Bigger Pockets. It's a real estate podcast. Well, they've got real estate in the name because they know we want people to search real estate and find us. Or there's a show called Syntax Web Development Treats, or Tasty Web Development Treats. Well, they know people are searching web development, so they want that in there. I want to give you Apple's advice. Apple says, pay close attention to the title, the author, and the description, because Apple Podcasts uses these fields for search. This is a direct quote. Make your title specific. A podcast called Our Community Bulletin is too vague to attract subscribers, no matter how compelling the content. Now, one thing that people often get sucked into doing, and this is not a good idea, is stuffing. It's like the Albin podcast, best tips, how to start a podcast, entrepreneur, online marketing, and they stick all the stuff together and they submit it to Apple and it gets kicked right out. Because Apple doesn't want you stuffing all these keywords in there. They want you to put in exactly what your podcast is about. So Apple specifically says, focus on your title, focus on the description, focus on the author tag. All those are used for search. So make sure those are all completely filled out and have a lot of good info there. Sometimes people here start thinking, oh, let's jump in and start doing some artwork. Well, we're not going to do artwork now. The reason we're not going to get into the artwork piece is because artwork is so much harder to change than text. And as we're recording episodes, it's going to be pretty easy for you to update your concept over time as you start to think, oh, maybe the title's changing or what we're focusing on is maybe shifted. So it's easy to update that text. It's hard if you've just asked someone to put together some custom artwork for you. So we'll hold off till later and then we'll come back to this. All right, so that's everything we have for developing your podcast concept. We talked about the incredible opportunities in podcasting, and I really hope I convinced you of how podcasting is a little different and there's a lot of opportunity still there. Then the main things, we had 3 main things. We talked about why you are starting a podcast, what that podcast is about, and we picked a name. And I want you to write the answers to those questions down because those are going to feed into everything else we do and all the videos coming up. Because next video, we're going to talk about format. So format, we're going to talk about what type of podcast. We'll go through different types of shows there are. What type should you make? And then we'll talk about the optimal length for a podcast episode. Get there. someone. And then we're going to talk at the end about how often you should publish, like every day, once a week. So we'll get into all the formatting stuff in the next video. We're really excited you're on this journey with us. One thing that really is exciting for us is knowing as we're filming this, thousands of the people who watch it are going to launch successful shows. So we're really excited to be a part of that, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks, Melissa.
Welcome. Stop sharing. Where am I?
All right. So as you begin to think about starting your own podcast, those are some very important questions to ask yourself. What is a podcast? Why am I starting a podcast? What is my podcast about? And also, I have some other questions that you have to ask yourself. Who is my podcast audience? Another thing you should consider is, am I a good communicator, or do I just like to talk? Do I have the time to invest in my podcast? You have to make time to sit down and discuss what your podcast is about on that particular day, if you're getting a guest. How long do I want each podcast episode to be? For a lot of people, maybe a half an hour is good. Maybe 10 minutes is even better. But then you have other people who have podcasts that last for 2 and 3 hours, which is amazing to me. But they're confident in the content that they're presenting. How much money should I invest in equipment just starting out? And let me just pause here. I invested a good sum of money, and you don't have to do that. Honestly, for those of you who have cell phones and earphones or earpods, you can definitely start your podcast just with that equipment alone. Now, you have to ask yourself, what level of quality is that going to be? And if you're trying to get a YouTube channel where your podcast can also be seen as well as heard, then you have to ask yourself again, how good is my camera? How good is my lighting? That kind of thing. As of right now, I don't have a YouTube channel for my podcast. So I'm strictly audio. So no one needs to see anything that I'm doing right now, because I'm just going audio. But the trend is that you start your podcast and you get your YouTube channel, and the two come together. Because people are very visual, they want to see what's going on, and not everyone is in their car. Some people are just simply home, and they just scroll through YouTube on their phones, on their tablets, computers, or whatever. Something else to keep in mind, how much, is my podcast sustainable? In other words, can I keep doing this podcast? Or is it just for a specific time period? Something you want to try out for a moment, see how it is, and then get out of the space? Or do you want to do something for the long haul? And the last question is, can I make money podcasting? Well, as of right now, it's about a $15 billion a year industry. And it's pretty much on schedule to reach about 25 billion by 2024, 2025. So there's a lot of money to be made in the podcast space. And as Albin mentioned on the video, not everyone is going to be a Joe Rogan. Not everyone is going to get billions of subscribers following them and advertisers chasing after them. But there are ways that you can make money podcasting and monetize this space, because there are a lot of people who are willing to pay you to advertise their product, whatever that product is. And that's where you have to allow yourself some room to negotiate, or maybe humble yourself and say, you know what, I'm trying to get this podcast out there, let me go ahead and take this $15 from this company to do an advertisement for them. So those are things that you are needing to consider when starting your podcast. Are there any questions before I go on? Because I want to get into part 2. Any questions for me about?
I have a question, Tony. So
Yeah,
I know you did a little bit, but what made you want to do this? Like you said, you've been thinking about it for a while, but what was the thing that made you finally start?
So in my heart of hearts, I love having conversations with people. I'm not a big social media person. I love sitting down and just having regular conversations with people. I do text because I have to, because that's how people like to communicate. And I may connect with somebody on social media, but I started this primarily because I like to sit down and have conversations. And then the other part was that at the age of 19, I almost died from an E. coli bacteria. Almost lost my life, and I survived. Obviously, I'm here talking to you. And so I knew that I had a purpose in life. And I didn't know at the time specifically what my purpose would be and how it would be sustained over the years. But for the last 31 years, I've been able to work with young people very intimately and kind of like this, virtually, over this last year of the pandemic. Usually it's in person, but I started it because I wanted to hear people's stories. I had a story to tell, other people have stories to tell, and why not sit down and have a conversation about how you grew up? Where did it start for you? That's one of the questions that I like to ask my guests when they come on and I interview them. So that's basically how it started. And there was just this sense of urgency after the pandemic. It was like, all right, I was supposed to start it last year. I couldn't do it. So this year was just the perfect opportunity to launch. So thank you for that question.
Welcome. Adriana has shared about her goddad has a podcast. Adriana, can you share a little bit about it? Because I'm thinking like maybe some teens on here may say, well, that's something for older people. Like I'm podcast. I'm not interested in that. So Adriana, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with podcasts? Or anyone else who has listened to a podcast?
They could be funny and really informational. Like you can find a lot of stuff out in the podcast because they just be talking about like current life events and like they'll bust in a couple jokes or whatever. Make it's like real humorous stuff going on. So I like that.
You have
And
a favorite
like,
podcast? You have a favorite podcast you like to listen to?
Me and my boyfriend, we listen to the Joe Budden podcast.
Okay.
But
Joe Budden, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Dave? You watch a couple. What's the name of the podcast? A couple of podcasts, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, I think it's Joe Wright. What's his name? Joe Wright or something like that.
What made you start listening to the podcast?
Honestly, it was more like it was an accident. It was like I was interested in this guy that, what's his name again? Bob Lazar.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you just
he was on the podcast, so I was just listening to what he was saying, and it was interesting.
So he was a guest on the podcast.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Right. So then after that, you just started listening to more.
Yeah, and before I was listening to podcasts like rappers and musicians and all of that.
Anybody else? Anybody else want to share about their experience? Melina says, my brother used to do a podcast with his friend on YouTube, and they basically had a theme each episode and talked about life stories and their personalities. That's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Adriana says she started off watching Wallow and Gilly, I think it is. No Jumper. Is that the name of the podcast?
Yeah, Gildy the Kid. Yeah, that's the one I listen to too. So
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dave. Thanks, Akia.
Yeah.
And Adriana said, Melina, that's the same thing that her brother does. The same kind of thing with the life stories. And it sounds like that's kind of how Tony got involved, with just kind of telling his story and then asking people to tell their stories. And I listen to his podcast, and I like hearing about, how people, the path that people took. We're talking about achievement this week, Tony, and I'm trying to help the young people see like there's different paths to achievement. It's not always this one path that people talk about. Everybody's not going to go down that same path. And you know that, but sometimes you can get caught up thinking that there's only a couple of ways to achieve things, to feel like we're successful. I think podcasts help us to see that people take different paths, and they see achievement in different ways. Somebody asked, is Steve Harvey Morning Show, is that a podcast?
That's a regular television show, but I do believe he has a podcast.
Okay. So the morning show itself is the radio show or TV show, and then but he has a separate podcast.
Right. So you have streaming platforms. You have Apple Podcasts, you have Google Podcasts, Amazon Now Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many others that you can listen to. Tune in. And it's almost like going to Google, where you just go to these streaming platforms and you put in a keyword of what you want to search for. Maybe you want to listen to something about finance. So you'll put in finances, and then all of the podcasts centered around finances will come up. Or if you want to listen to something about sports, there's a ton of podcasts out there that talk about sports all day long or in their episodes. So whatever you want to find, it's pretty much out there. One of the things that I love about podcasting is that it helps a person to become a better listener, especially if it's not on YouTube, because there's nothing for you to see. You have to really listen. And one of the things that I teach students about communication skills is that you have to develop good listening skills. Listening is a discipline. Most people want to talk when they're in the space with other people. They want to share. Very few people sponge and just listen. Some people listen long enough to jump in at a certain point so that they can share something about something that has nothing to do with what the conversation is about. So that's one of the reasons why I really, really love the podcast space, because you have to listen. If I'm in my car, I'm not looking at a YouTube video of this podcast. I'm listening very intently about what the people are saying and what are they providing for me. How can they provide some kind of substance that I can take away from this and feel like I've learned something or I've grown. My podcast is called Leave Empty. Leave Empty is centered around people discovering their purpose, potential, and leaving a lasting legacy. All of us are here for a purpose, I believe. And so why not tap into our potential so that we can maximize on our purpose? So Leave Empty is something that came up back in the 90s when I was much younger, and it stayed with me all this time because I heard about people who leave or transition out of here, but they never really fulfilled their purpose. So that's how I came up with my podcast. Leave Empty. Doesn't matter how old you are and what you're doing, make sure that you're tapping into your potential so that you can maximize on your purpose. All of us are here for a reason. So that's why I like to get at people's stories. Some other things that I wanted to share with you guys, and Alvin touched on it in the video, is the podcasting format. If you are a person who loves to communicate and you don't need a guest or an audience, then a solo podcast would be good for you. And guess what? It doesn't need to be very long. Maybe it can be in journal form or diary form, where you're just sharing some things about your day or your current experiences. And it's just you and the microphone, and you're just talking, and you're sharing from your heart, you're sharing your thoughts, you're sharing your insights. So that's good for people who like to just communicate what they're feeling or what they're experiencing um, in that particular podcast format. The other one is bringing on a guest like I do. I bring on a guest. I'm looking forward. I'm getting ready to interview a group of sisters that have a very interesting story. Some of them were in foster care. Some of them were with other relatives, and then they all came back together. 5 sisters. Um, I don't think the brother can make it, but it's 4 of the sisters who are going to be talking about their journey. So I'm looking forward to that. So I'm bringing on guests. So you can do a guest, or you could do a co-host podcast where you and the person bounce stuff off of each other. I think somebody mentioned Joe Budden. I believe there are 3 other guests on there besides Joe Budden, and they have a topic and they just talk about it. Or the Breakfast Club. You have Angela Yee, Charlemagne, and then you have DJ Envy. And then sometimes they talk amongst themselves, and other times they bring on guests to interview. So maybe you want to co-host, or maybe you want to bring on different guests. And then you, as it was mentioned, decide what category. What category do I want to talk about? Do I want to talk about politics? Do I want to talk about motherhood or fatherhood or teenage years, school, education? What is it that I want to talk about? And those are the things that you have to really stop and ask yourself. All right, I'm getting ready to start this podcast, but what is it that I want to convey to the audience? All right. And then, of course, growing your podcast, you want to tell your friends, or you want to advertise on social media. Word of mouth is always good. Um, Advertising, maybe you want to make up some cards or flyers to hand out to people. And then sometimes people get a virtual assistant that will help them with all of it. So those are the things that you have to consider when growing your podcast. And that's the space that I'm in right now, growing my podcast. Your friends are going to listen more than likely. So how do you get other people who don't know you to listen to what you have to say? And keep in mind that you are interested. You have some things that you can share, that you can talk about, that people can find value in and appreciate your podcast. Melissa, can you show them the picture of my setup that I sent you? Okay, so that's my current setup. I have my iPad that looks like a composition book. I have the audio interface that's called the Rodecaster Pro. See the Audio Technica microphones. I have uh, a microphone called a pod mic and 2 speakers on the side, and a monitor. And this is all in my basement. I converted my basement to my podcast studio. And so this is where I do my interviews. This is where people come and sit down. But maybe you don't have the time or energy or the money to invest. Maybe you do. Maybe you have the space. Maybe you can get all of this and then some. Whatever works for you. I don't tell people this is what you need. And if you don't get this, then your podcast isn't official. Like I said earlier, you can start with your cell phone and your cell phone usually records really good audio. And if you have a good set of earbuds, AirPods, whatever you have, those mics on those things usually work pretty good. And you can possibly interview somebody who may be your guest or something. This is something called an audio splitter. I don't know if everybody can see that, but maybe somebody else, you plug this in, and maybe you can interview somebody. So sky's the limit. You're not limited in this day and age because the technology is available.
So you
All
can
right,
buy
and
like
I'm
some
gonna
of those, like how much does like a splitter like that cost? Just to give people an idea. If that's working
okay.
your iPhone, right?
Yeah, yep. So you would just get the adapter for this.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an iPhone or if you don't have a 3.5 millimeter jack on your phone, you would get the adapter. And something like this is like $7, maybe I think.
Okay. So with
Yeah.
with your iPhone and a splitter and your, I guess you need your headphones kind of hear yourself, and you don't have to, I guess, have even those. But what's the minimum that you need? You think you need to get started?
To get started, I would say less than $30.
Less than $30.
Yeah.
And I know a
Because
lot.
there are people who will host your podcast for free.
Mhm.
Now, with that free subscription, you get limited time. So you may only get 2 hours of podcasting time.
Okay.
Well, that might be more than enough if your podcast only lasts 15 minutes. And then you can do maybe 5 to 10 podcasts each month for free. You have to do a lot of the groundwork
Mhm.
that they do, such as getting your stuff out to Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the other places where you get your podcast. But when you do the paid subscription, it's only, I would say, about $13 a month.
That's not bad.
I have a plan where I'm doing about $18 a month, and I get 6 hours of record time.
Yeah, that's
So
plenty.
not very expensive to get into the podcasting space.
So Melina, do you have a podcast? Because I see you in the chat, and you have a lot to say about this. So do you actually have a podcast? I think she's trying to come off of mute. Melina? Oh. You said, oh, you have the audio splitter for your PC. Okay, I just saw you had a lot to say about. I know your brother has the podcast, right? Have you ever been on a podcast with your brother? No, because you have so much to share. A lot of people in here have shared just from conversations in our workshops, and just their insight and their way of looking at things is so different and unique that I think a lot of times people say, oh, nobody wants to hear what I have to say. But you'd be
Right.
surprised. You really be surprised how many people can be inspired and informed and educated by what you have to say. Just like other people inspire and inform and educate you.
Yeah.
So I
Never
want
sell
you to
yourself
think
short.
about that. Nope.
Yeah.
Like we said.
You don't have to be any big name person to have something to say.
Mhm.
Like I said, all of us have a story.
Right.
All of us have a journey that we're on, and we can share from that perspective.
Right.
And like Miss Melissa said, sometimes people just need to hear other young people talking and sharing their stories, talking about and sharing their stories, and how they're navigating through life with whatever choices they've made, how they've bounced back, how they picked themselves up, got themselves back together. I heard somebody mentioning earlier that they focused on school, Melissa. Is that correct?
Say it again. They did what? I didn't hear your question.
Oh, they focused on school. I thought I heard somebody talking about that when we first came on, that they really focused on school.
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I know
Okay.
that somebody was focusing on learning from their mistakes. I think that's an amazing conversation that people can have. I think is
Hmm.
one of the things that I've learned a lot from people is people who have experienced failure or made a lot of mistakes and then they share, but down they're successful. I think that's very inspiring, especially from a young person. You know, I don't hear a lot of young people. I was looking for podcasts from teens, and there's a lot out there, but there could be more. I just
Hmm.
think, you know, there's so much more from your perspective. Kayla says there's a podcast on Spotify called
Spotify.
Teenager Therapy that I like. I gotta check that one
Okay.
out. I haven't
Hmm.
seen that one. Oh, it's by teenagers. I think I did see that. I
Yeah.
think I have seen that. Do they put it on YouTube too? That sounds familiar. And if it's the same one, it's really good. Okay. Well, think about it.
Yeah.
I want you guys to think about it, Tony. If you want to just finish up, I think they might be quiet, but they're always listening.
Well, I just want to say thank you, first of all, for inviting me to come, Melissa. And
You're welcome.
thank you and Adrian for having me. I appreciate the time and opportunity to share what I've learned so far. I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but I had to start. And as it was mentioned in the video, he would meet up with people, and a year later, I'm going to launch, I'm going to launch. Then a year later, I'm going to launch. Sometimes you just have to discipline yourself and say, you know what? Give yourself a goal and say,
Right.
I am going to achieve this goal. I was telling people that by the beginning of June, middle of June, my podcast was going to launch. And I don't know if they believe me or not. It didn't matter to me. I put it out there. So now I have to be a person of my word. I believe in integrity. I believe in saying what you mean and meaning what you say. And once I did that, then I put the pressure on myself and launched the podcast. I did all of the groundwork. It was grueling for the first 2 weeks, just staying up at night and calling around and people saying that they're going to come through and then they don't come through. And it's like, okay, all right, I have to start regardless of what's not happening the way that I want it to.
Right.
So I say, set your goals, stick to those goals, and whether or not people support you in trying to reach your goals, make sure that you're doing it for you. And if you have children, make sure that you're doing it for you and your children. Position yourself for greatness because greatness is in you. And I believe that if you do that, then you'll achieve it. So those are
That's
my
great.
final words.
Thank you, Tony. Those are great words of inspiration. And I just want to say that I know we have some teen parents on the line, and we have other people who, like, maybe because of your schedule and things, this might be something you might want to start, where if you don't want to get a full-time job or even a part-time job because of everything that you have going on, not that this isn't work, but sometimes because you can do it from your home, this might be a way to begin, you know, just a career or to begin having these conversations. I know we have people on the call who have shared that they're interested in being content creators or YouTube influencers. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is just another path. So maybe you don't want to have, like, I mean, I know on YouTube you can do voiceovers and things, but a lot of the thing about YouTube is that you have to be visual. You have to be on the screen in a lot of cases. So maybe you're not that person who's comfortable necessarily in front of the camera, you know, being seen that way, but you still have a lot to say. So a podcast is a way to be in that space without having to do the video piece. So that's another way to look at it. So I just want to thank you, Tony. Gave them something to think about. I know there's somebody on here who may be inspired now to move forward and tell their story. I know we have some great stories on here.